Up to $26,000 per employee? They call it the 15-minute refund, but it's not a gimmick. It's for business owners who stuck it out during the pandemic. The Employee Retention Tax Credit, or ERTC. But time is running out to get started. Talk to the experts. JWC Advisors at iHeartTaxRefunds.com. Who are they? CPAs who will keep you on the right side of the IRS. So do it the right way. Go to iHeartTaxRefunds.com. That's iHeartTaxRefunds.com.
Hello world, I'm Dr. John Bruni and you're listening to STRATEGIKON, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Future war. The words sound as dangerous as they sound exciting. But what does one think of when one thinks of future war? Lasers? Killer robots? Special forces? Drones? Missiles? Sleek fighter planes? Yes, these are all the ingredients of future war and future war fighting. But focusing on these things makes future war look and feel as though it's all about the technology and Hollywood-esque imagery. But the avid STRATEGIKON listener will know by now that this is not the case. War is not clean, it is not surgical, and things often go horribly wrong. Take one of the most exciting aspects of future war, weaponry. Weapons are designed primarily to destroy and to be destroyed. For this to happen in a way that makes sense for a national armed force, they should be built ruggedly and affordably. Very few weapons today are built with this philosophy in mind. They are often over-engineered, complex, and created for the purpose of intimidation rather than actual conflict. Yes, many even look beautiful. Some manned aircraft and warships have the grace of high-end Italian sports cars. However, this all comes at a cost. Today, countries around the world buy fewer and fewer high-tech capital equipment for their armed forces. The costs associated with defense acquisition are ruinous. But they buy them not in the hope of using them, but in the hope that their adversaries will be too frightened to go to war. Their effect, therefore, is more of a balance of power deterrence thing, 90% psychology with a 10% outside chance of actual use. But what happens when this system breaks? What happens when near-peer competitors decide that something is worth fighting and dying for no matter the cost, and all of these complex, fragile, high-tech systems start shooting at each other? If a country loses a $13 billion aircraft carrier in the opening salvo, can such a vessel be replaced from the public treasury? What about aircraft that cost in excess of $200 million per plane? Or will these weapons live up to the hype that they are either impervious to enemy fire or invisible to detection? If the latter is the case, the return on investment may well be worth it, since what you have bought can win the war. If the former, then we'd be in serious trouble, since the war will quickly grind to a halt because no one could afford to replace weapons lost in combat. In the shadow of the US PRC trade war and ongoing tensions between the US and Iran, we thought that we'd look at the awful reality of future war, the reality that no one wants to face. How do you prosecute a war with fragile, expensive systems?
Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that STRATEGIKON can be found on the Ozcast network, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. We're joined with John and David.
All right, so I suppose when we are starting to look at the cost of high-tech weapons, David, can we actually fight a war, and what will future war look like? I mean, after you've had your grand orgasmic deployment of weapons and everyone's shooting at each other, what happens once the missiles run low? What happens when the aircraft get shot out of the sky? What happens when the warships get blown out of the water or the tanks get, hammered? Who is going to be replacing these things at cost to the state?
Well, there's about 27 questions in that.
There is.
Let's start with the underlying assumption that I think has changed, and see if we all agree that something's fundamentally changed. Traditionally, most bullets missed, most dumb weapons didn't hit targets precisely, and as we've gone to more and more precise targeting, we've gone to more and more technology, and in the main we've seen this in a very one-sided way. We've seen the helicopter or plane or drone launch something targeted to take out a car or a bunch of bods somewhere in the Badlands. What we haven't really conceived of is that level of sophisticated targeting against other people with weapons with the same level of sophisticated targeting, and with both sides having sophisticated countermeasures.
So real near-peer competitors have not made an entrance since World War II.
And last time we had near-peer, it was with dumb weapons.
Well, well, yes, exactly. But the thing that weaponry now is so dependent on is satellite information for targeting purposes. So arguably those countries at the near-peer level, countries like, for instance, the People's Republic or Russia, if we were to assume that they were going to pose clear and present dangers to the West, they would try to, well, their first strike should actually be against Western satellites. The reason being that will confound Western targeting, which will mean that all the smart munitions that we've been paying for will not be smart munitions. They'll be dumb weapons, essentially.
Well, it's a nice assumption, and it was the assumption made that Peter W. Singer made in Ghost Fleet, that the first hit would be lasers in space on communications and GPS satellites. If we're already seeing in the last couple of weeks, the Americans just announced a surface-to-surface missile that targets on its own.
Targets on its own, independent of satellite information. Okay.
That can keep track on its target. So once it knows what it's chasing, it theoretically, well, they're saying it has the ability to keep chasing the target. At the same time, this is coming online. We've also got the Americans saying that this year they will fit a high-powered laser onto a destroyer.
Yeah.
And they're about to do the first sea trial of their railgun that they've been testing on land. And all right, the testing on land by all accounts has not gone brilliantly. It's 3 years late, but you don't go to sea testing until something works. What's the point? We know the Chinese have a small railgun already on one vessel. So in a sense, Singer had a lot of imagination in Ghost Fleet to go lasers taking out satellites. But if we go into energy weapons, hypersonic weapons, and smart missiles that can manage targeting on their own once they've initially acquired the target, do big satellites really matter? And in a world where we just saw SpaceX put up the first 60 microsatellites of a global network, how many different companies are going to put up microsatellites for communications that in the end could provide a mesh block GPS system that may not be accurate enough to put the missile through the window, but could still take out the building?
Yeah, but the problem with all of these ambitions, of course, is that space is already overcrowded. Low Earth orbit is full of rubbish. Not only rubbish, but also satellites having to navigate the rubbish. If anyone were to take out, more satellites in the course of a war in order to blind your opponent, then what ends up happening is that you create more space junk, which will not only affect your enemy's satellite capacities, but also your own.
So again, it sounds like you're assuming there's big important ones. What if it's 20,000 small satellites able to provide mesh blocks to get rough targeting? All they've got to do is last the first week of advanced weapons being used against other advanced weapons and advanced countermeasures being used against other advanced countermeasures. Whether space looks like a junkyard after, I think will be very similar to whether the battlefield looks like a junkyard after.
Well, I mean, if it gets back to what the initial question was, what's future war going to look like? We have the idea that everyone's going to be lining up all their top-rate kit. That top-rate kit at a reasonable clip may take many months to produce out of a factory. So they are, very expensive, very complex, very fragile as systems, not easily replaced by the state because of their extraordinary cost. Once those things are gone and you are left with a mess, but the unresolved issues between the great powers that had fought the war remain unresolved, there will be a desire to continue to fight, but with what?
Well, let's make the point that you've lost potentially all your advanced equipment and countermeasures. You've also taken out most of what you're relying on in space to make that possible. So you've potentially affected communications and GPS for the foreseeable future. So navigation and targeting are back to, say, 1980s level dumb technology compared to now. So do we fall straight back from whatever it is, say 2025 when this kicks off, to mid-80s in terms of what technology is relevant for warfare? If we've used up all the advanced stuff and all the advanced countermeasures, do we go back to, extremely long range, kinetic violence and up close kinetic violence, all of it rather unguided?
Well, that sounds like the very obvious fallback position that we have. In many ways, I suppose the other big threat, longer-term threat, would be that if the big powers were to clash at that level, and I'm not necessarily sure that they would, but if they do, then once the big powers lose their first-tier weapons and they have to then fight with second-tier weapons, that then creates a bit of a level playing field for, lesser developed powers that already have well-entrenched second-tier weapons to take on the large powers in their various regions.
Well, it evens up the playing field, which is then fascinating because alliances, you would assume, would become infinitely more important.
Yeah.
The once you're not afraid of being taken out by that first week of top-tier weapons because they're gone, then you're like, well, we can be in this war if we want, as an ally, helping to get a win and helping to get a deal.
Mm.
And for manufacturers like the Russians who specialise in selling second-tier weapons, the Brazilians who could make planes to fit that role, no problems, the Turks who imagine making lots of stuff at that spec level, suddenly the benefit for these states who can't provide top-tier weapons but can provide masses of second-tier technology could be huge.
I think that one of the things that needs to be sort of unpacked here, of course, is while this idea of near-peer war looks like it may be possible to conceive of, considering the problems that we have currently between the United States and China, between the United States and North Korea, between the United States and Iran.
Yeah, but again, you've just put two not near peers in that mix. Do we want to leave them in?
Well, I think
they can go mental for a sec.
Well, it depends on how you fight, doesn't it really?
Yeah, but the Iranians will use up their technology in the first few days and then bleed the Americans out, the same as Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes, but what about the possibility of the Chinese actually entering one of these smaller conflicts between the United States and, say, North Korea? Or
Why would they do that if they
Iran
could just watch the Americans bleed again?
Well, they'd certainly watch the Americans bleed again if the Chinese were to land some, high tech on Iran's doorstep during a crisis, right?
Yeah, but again, this is this first potential week. If the Iranians, for example, or the North Koreans could get enough stuff from the Russians and Chinese to make that first week even more devastating, to guarantee that it cost the Americans more to take ground, and then bleed them for 10 years, like Afghanistan or Iraq, it seems the horror story of the Americans will assume shock and awe again, not understanding. Well, they don't seem to ever learn this lesson.
No, they don't.
And that is, if you totally break a place that people don't like you, that doesn't really seem very complicated to me.
See, with Iran, Iran is slightly different from both Afghanistan and Iraq in one key aspect. Iran is, or considers itself, a civilizational power. It has more heft at the political level, whether it be under the control of Ayatollahs now or whether under the Shahs before. But the fact of the matter is that Iran believes itself to be something much more significant as an international player. And it has offensive capabilities through its proxies in places like Syria and Lebanon. So, it can actually affect strategy at a much broader basis. It gives them more cards to play. The Iraqis were never, Saddam Hussein may have thought that he was a player, but in actual fact, he was boxed in. His military was pretty much starved of most resupply after the 1991 war. And so therefore, Iraq's capacity to act in an offensive manner in 2003 was, dare I say, extraordinarily limited. So considering all of those factors, if America were to challenge Iran, yes, the two countries would not come with the same amount of military hardware to the battlefield, but they would have their own advantages. And Iran, I don't believe, would settle for fighting a defensive campaign on its own territory against American forces. I think that they would be more inclined to try to keep the US off balance by using their proxies in a clever manner and throwing various expeditions out into the greater Middle East to destabilize America's position.
Yeah, but that would all be going at the same point that the Americans are doing something dense. Let's go back to last week, Mike Pence talking at West Point.
Yep.
Essentially, we've now had the Vice President of the US come out and say, class of West Point, get ready for half of your career being at war. Something Vice Presidents normally don't say at West Point.
Yep, that's true.
So, why? Is this the rebirth of the project for the new American century? Does this essentially mean the American desire to transform the world is back in the game? And if the Americans, and I'm not saying anyone in uniform wants to transform the world here, listeners. We're talking about the political elite who make the insane decision, not the people who have to fight the war. And if there is some return to the project for the new American century mindset happening within the United States political elite, then they will not think carefully or cautiously or strategically. PNAC have never thought cautiously, carefully or strategically. They just imagine that if they turn the world into something like them, everything will be nicer.
The whole notion being might is right, and kinetic power will be able to create a basis of behavior modification for states.
So really, immaterial of what the Iranians do after the Americans do something stupid, I still cannot conceive that if we're seeing the return of Project for the New American Century, if PNAC's back, then the Americans won't fight clever wars. The political elite won't be able to conceive of that.
Can I be particularly nasty here for 1 second? And that is, I don't think that the Americans since the end of World War II has fought clever wars. I suppose one could say that Korea would have been a justified campaign, but once the Chinese entered the fray in 1951, things turned around pretty badly, and the Americans couldn't use technology to its advantage except to fight the Chinese to a draw. Vietnam was a loss. The only major victories that the Americans had in that period from 1945 to today really was Grenada in 1983. Against a very tiny Caribbean island and a few hold-up Cubans with AK-47s. Three. Panama, where they used clever psychological operations to get rid of Manuel Noriega, and of course the 1991 Gulf War, where the Americans dominated the entire domain across all sectors.
1990s versus 1970s to see. Yeah. I would spin that a little bit differently, and that would be to say, in the Korea after World War II, you had a political elite who had drunk the Kool-Aid about stopping communism, an exhausted population and an exhausted military, and then the idea of having to come up with a unified, broader than US command, and it was an existential threat. So relative to all that garbage going on, the fact it was fought to a draw, not really so bad. Vietnam, the political elite, had one mission. The military were never allowed to play, fight, win and evolve, so they lost.
Yeah, but one could play historical counterfactuals of Vietnam, but ultimately the chips were always against the Americans, right, in the Vietnam scenario?
The chips were against the Americans because they didn't understand it was a war of national liberation.
Yeah, but that seems to have been a problem for the Americans moving forward from Vietnam.
So this is a constant problem of a political elite that don't understand the wars they send their militaries to, and then don't let their militaries evolve to fight those wars.
It's interesting. I just had a thought. I'm reading Jared Diamond's latest work, Upheaval, and Diamond comes up with a very interesting sort of idea about states kind of acting like individuals writ large, which is sometimes in vogue in international relations theory, sometimes out of vogue, depending on where on the spectrum of international relations you come from. But the fact is that with the Americans always seeming to have to relearn the same lessons, is it a case that the giant that is the United States, sitting on top of the international system that they helped create after World War II, suffers from some form of strategic Alzheimer's.
Well,
they
I'd
can't.
say let's hook it to Diamond. His big idea in the book is selective adaptation.
Yep.
You don't change too much, you only change what needs to. The problem is, if in most ways you're winning, why change? The political elite's children don't die anymore. So it's not really in their interest to change. Only post 9/11 do we see that the political elite had so little understanding of the wars they started that finally the military were allowed to evolve. Selective adaptation was allowed to happen within the military. They were allowed to rediscover counterinsurgency even though it didn't work. They took counterterrorism to a level no one else has managed before. But that is a few selective adaptations in uniform. I do not believe there is any significant evidence of selective adaptation in the political elite. And really, last year in the congressional elections, yes, we saw a few veterans make it into Congress, not as many as I would have hoped to have seen, because what you need if you want to change in your political elite is for people who've already been through selective adaptation in their first career, in uniform, to come to Congress with selective adaptation in their head. And they certainly have it, but they're not a big enough group to enforce selective adaptation.
Will they ever be a big enough group?
No.
I mean, if for instance, like the US military seems to be, suffering from the same fate as the Australian military. I mean, at the moment, the military seems to be the Praetorian Guard of government. Government will control the military, send it off on missions, do all those kind of things. But the community basis for support, the very idea of the citizen soldier, the concerned person who really loves his or her country, wears the uniform, does their job, cycles back through Civvy Street, and then can do that adaptive behavior, just doesn't exist anymore because we've successfully hived off those people who are inclined toward the military to stay in their little box, and the rest of society just, keeps on going.
Well, I'd say that's one big difference between Australia and the US. Is in Australia, yes, we have most definitely separated out the community that are willing and able and made sure they're not a big enough force to affect anything, but outcomes in war. The reality is in America, and PNAC understand this, they certainly did in the 90s, and I think they probably still do, and that is there are enough people who are not benefiting from the quote-unquote supposed economic growth post-GFC.
Yeah.
What economic growth?
Yeah. The idea is there, but it doesn't work out as well as it did under Truman, when Truman tried integration between black and white soldiers, where there was a real effort at trying to reintegrate American society and using the military as a bedrock for that. In America today, it's like, okay, you've got a lot of Hispanics and people who are falling out in East LA and whatnot, joining the ranks of the military because of the lack of economic opportunities. But once they've done their service, they go back to the barrios. They don't necessarily...
No, and this is the problem. Truman worked with a socially cohesive population.
Yes.
And now you're trying to build militaries out of, asocial... I'll say asocial rather than antisocial. It's not that they're antisocial. It's just there is no broad conception of society to belong to. So the military tribe works for a while, but also you're not fighting for existential threat. You're not fighting wars that convince people that this is going to save or improve the world. So people don't make whole careers of it. It's not transformative. It's transactional.
This is a very interesting point, getting back to the initial title of this podcast, and that is Future War. So in this kind of disassociated mess that we currently face socially and politically, how then do we actually see near-peer countries fight wars? Because there, of course, there's the weaponry issue, which we've already touched on, but there are also things like demographics of countries that play a role. You mentioned earlier about, the Chinese being very wary about moving forward because, of course, first sons are first sons because of the one-child policy. If they all end up in uniform and go off and fight the war, families will lose their first sons. That is a cultural no-no from a Chinese perspective because they want to actually look after the next generation.
So the Chinese desperately need the first week of advanced weapons to be successful, and then after that to just be brutalising people they're used to brutalising, i.e. the Tibetans and the Uyghurs.
Yeah.
The idea of using first sons for anything else is just potentially too devastating.
Yeah.
Whereas this is an advantage that the Russians had, was life was always cheap to the Russians. The problem is their population is now in decline.
Yep.
The Americans are the only group where they don't admit it, but there is always people who need a way out of poverty in the US. and the military is that traditional path.
So long as
When
the military maintains the concept of social integration and social fluidity, that if you end up becoming an officer in the US military, it's not just about, your rank once you're wearing uniform, but also the ability to move back into Civvy Street at a higher level from when you once were. And I think that's an important aspect as well, which I'm not so sure that the US military still holds on to. They may talk about it.
Well, Robert Putnam, so Mr. Social Capital, made the point when he came to Adelaide and did a masterclass that the US military is about the only thing left that broadly provides social mobility. That the gap between those who have and those who haven't is now so large. And the military is one of the only ways left to get the chance to get the education that you couldn't have otherwise and not be crippled by the debt.
There's the other aspect of the whole demographic issue as well, and that is, we can talk about war in the idea of that it's all about the weapons, but ultimately it's all about the people. And because most of the armed forces of today in the West, and generally it's a trend that's being seen elsewhere, the professionalization of the military means that we have all volunteer force structures, which are by nature much smaller than conscript force structures. So once you start losing manpower, skilled manpower who know how to fly an F-A-18 or a stealth fighter or, drive a tank or a ship of some sophistication, once you lose those people with the skills necessary to drive the sophisticated hardware that you're losing, who is going to fight the war? I mean...
Well, we're seeing that in Sweden at the moment.
Yeah.
The Swedish military has collapsed in size. They've had their holy crap moment. And realised that the Russians are terrifying them. They've reinitiated national service, but now with a tiny military barely big enough to train recruits, let alone do anything, with most competences pretty much having been lost or now being 10 years out of date.
Are we going to be starting to see, the reintroduction of conscription, especially now that the world seems to be a far more dangerous and unpredictable place? The concept of the nation is now making a comeback in many countries. Many countries are starting to view their neighbours not in favourable terms, in terms of, cooperative allies, but uncooperative belligerents. Will there be a call for nations to do more in terms of protecting themselves, and will that include reintroducing conscription?
It seems to me it almost becomes a must. Because unless you believe you can get a decisive victory with your advanced weapons, and I'm not convinced of that, because even from the outside where we are, it looks like advanced countermeasures grow as fast as advanced weapons.
Yeah.
And it's just a slugfest, and watch the billions of dollars burn and watch your most competent people die. And then go, and now what? So
now with the killer robots, right?
No.
Because once you clear out your stocks...
Who can afford to make the killer robot? Again, in your first wave, we didn't even touch on potentially UAVs or drones or things essentially machine guided with the human only doing the final decision about pulling the trigger. But all that technology, none of that is going to be cheap either. It's all going to take months to build and cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars.
You're listening to Strategikon. On today's episode, we're talking with Dr. John Bruni and David Olney about the future of war. Right now, we're going to take a musical break and we're going to hear from a local Adelaide band called Leaf and Stem. This is their song, Always Yours.
I'm always yours, always will be for a good cause. 'Cause baby, and like no one else, when I hold you and tell you to be yourself,
Always Yours by Leaf and Stem. Check them out in the Facebook link in the episode description. We're going to head back to the discussions of future war with Dr. John Bruni and David Olney here on Strategikon.
Weaponry is an interesting topic to analyze because, we can talk about the weapon in isolation of how it's created, but we also know that many of the never-ending rising costs of weapons have a lot to do with the defense industries that are putting them together. You've got these large conglomerates that
who get rich while making weapons.
Well, exactly right, and they have very unhealthy relationships with
Congress.
their politicians. So you end up having pork barrel politics driving a lot of defence acquisitions. We see that here in Australia. We certainly see that in the United States. It's a legend in the United States, and people complain about it, and yet no one can do anything about it. So, in actual fact, one day the United States, in the not too distant future, if there thankfully won't be a war, but if they continue down this path, they will only be able to afford to buy one submarine or one aircraft and one tank because that's all their budget will be able to afford. Because not so much that the hardware and the software is so intrinsically expensive to put together, but it's because the people who are trying to put these things together are literally raping and pillaging the budgets that the US government or the Australian government or any other government is putting before them.
No, again, I'd break that into two things. One is the complexity of what you make. The very complex things become too difficult or too expensive. But more importantly, do you even have an industrial base that can be converted to making slightly simpler weapons? So if we look, most of the world in World War II, could move to some sort of production of the weapons of the era because it had an industrial base. So here in Australia, we have, Suave destroyers in the water now. What the hell are they going to fire once we run out of missiles? Could we even make replacement missiles?
No, we're going to just put our hand up and ask Uncle Sam to give us
And
another
if
box of
Uncle
missiles.
Sam's in the shit, we don't then get missiles. So the point with so much of this is the fall from first tier weapons to second tier almost seems inevitable when first tier is only made by so few people. So suddenly the advantage of being in a Russian city that can just crank out second tier weapons, or Turkey or Brazil or some other place that actually has an industrial base competent enough to en masse at reasonably low cost labour build dumb weapons systems.
Well, this is the very point that I'd like to actually raise, David, because ultimately we've all, pretty much most Western countries certainly have gotten out of the idea of producing their own weapons for their own national security requirements because it was not affordable. We thought that by farming the job out to people who are much better skilled at this kind of thing, we'd be able to buy weapons of superior quality. And so therefore we've got a consolidation of defense industry, whether it be in North America or Europe. But those consolidated defense industries, of course, form monopolistic blocks. And also, they have limits themselves. They only have a certain amount of productive capacities. So if, for instance, 5 or 6 countries purchase Company X's warships, and all of a sudden that country happens to go to war and loses 5 and those warships need to be replaced, they have to then go back to the mother company who may be offshore, either in Europe or North America, cap in hand. It's not even so much the government. The government may say, oh my God, our little RC allies are getting hammered. They need to get more ships. And they may put out the order to Company X to start cranking them out. But if Company X says, well, look, we'd love to do that, but unfortunately, for the last, 30-odd years, we've only had one line to build, these particular vessels.
Because we don't know how.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll be in some significant strife here. So the come-as-you-are war is a very real threat to our national security, whether it be here in Australia or elsewhere, because we just have refused to take our own national security requirements to heart and maintain at least a Tier 2 capacity to build weapons of sufficient quality and quantity. Doesn't have to be at the high end,
not to
but
still
sufficient.
be in the Tier 2 game.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Right.
This is why you sort of wonder what happens once the first tier stuff's gone, because the Americans have a massive advantage in huge amounts of stockpiled Tier 2 equipment.
Yep.
And tons of people trained on it because it's all they've got for the National Guard to train with. Australia stores a little bit of stuff, but nowhere enough. The Russians, most of the stuff got sold at the end of the Cold War to the Africans so they could kill each other during the 90s. The landmines, artillery, lots of other things. It was like, great, you're selling weapons to people who've got old grudges that were controlled by colonialism, and now let's put cheap arms in people's hands and make Africa's problems even deeper.
Yeah.
Well done, people.
Look at Sudan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, the Chinese, once all this first-tier stuff's gone, really all they seem to have is stuff to persecute their own people. So who can really go on beyond the initial phase? Now, we know that in a time of existential threat warfare, industry can be nationalised and you can go on to a war footing, but that still assumes technical competence.
But David, there's one thing missing from that. Yes, countries can do that, but could you imagine, say, the US government getting into a full-scale war with China, then turning around to, the likes of Lockheed Martin or, General Dynamics and saying, well, listen, guys, the days of you plundering our treasury are over. We're going to now control your entire structure to serve America's. They would be at the Supreme Court in a flash, and it wouldn't matter whether America was trying to drum up the whole nationalistic beat, saying, "Well, you're an American company, so therefore you serve us first and foremost, and when we, the government, tell you what to do, you do it." They would say, "Look, we are a multi-billion-dollar global entity. You don't tell us what to do, we tell you what to do."
But
and
to
then
me,
that would be it.
that's a secondary problem to the fact that, immaterially of whether you can persuade them, you do not have the technical capacity left to go into mass production.
Yeah.
You don't have 20 car makers. You don't have 20 heavy industry equipment makers who can convert. And this is not a slow march to war. This is, what do you do after the first tier stuff has burned with the limited people and resources left. So converting an economy that could take months, what good is that?
Well, the war will be over, certainly.
Well, that's the question, there's been a conflagration. And again, we're making the assumption, listeners, of no nuclear weapons, because that just gets even uglier. But also, I think most countries are smart enough, excluding probably the North Koreans, to not do it. To recognise.
I don't know, David. I don't know. I mean, look, indulge me here for a second. Let's do a little bit of speculation. I think our listeners will enjoy it. In terms of asymmetric war fighting between, say, a potential Sino-Russian bloc against, an American coalition, really nuclear weapons would have to be factored in, even if it were for posturing. Say, for instance, the Russians get into a spot of bother in the European theatre. They're getting pushed back. The likelihood of a front being broken decisively by NATO forces is high. You don't think that Vladimir Putin or whoever's running Russia at that time would not consider saying, I'm going to cast the nuclear umbrella over remaining Russian forces. If NATO forces continue to press on, we will use tactical nuclear weapons to stop them. I mean, as a threat, that should give people pause for thought, wouldn't it?
Well, I think it's a multi-phase thing. One, I can't imagine NATO breaking the Russians. I think it'll be the other way around.
Look, I mean, this is all
busy
it's all hypothetical.
But also, the critical difference, I think, is here. We're not talking about existential threat warfare for most countries. For Russia, war is going to be about survival of Putin's regime, not about existential threat for Russia. The fact that we've had China in the last few days come out and already do the threat of putting the price of rare earth elements up and denying access to rare earth elements. So the trade war is clearly hurting them so sufficiently that they've just grabbed some testicles and started twisting, which is what rare earth elements are for China. They are their greatest inflict pain card without going to the point of violence. So the fact they're already there is an indication of how much the trade war is hurting. The fact we've had a senior PLA officer saying don't push any more while in Singapore is unheard of. So to have those two things in a week means the Chinese are hurting, and they didn't, I don't think this would all ramp up so fast.
So what will the Chinese do under a situation like that? I mean,
well, this is another thing. It's not existential threat for China. It's existential threat for a regime.
Yes.
And with populations who may have been drip-fed Kool-Aid their whole lives, they still live in a world where there's more information than they know what to do with. So can you persuade a population to back war that is only about regime survival, is not about national survival?
All right. Well, in the Chinese situation, many people have said that the good thing about the communists was that it lifted some 400 million Chinese people out of poverty. And maybe the CCP will be thinking that they can call in their favors because, they can turn around and say, well, look, we didn't have to do anything other than continue Mao's economic policy after 1978. But we chose to go an enlightened route. Now, what we need from you guys who are now wealthy or middle class is, your first sons to basically fly the Chinese flag and defend our atolls in the South
and
China Sea.
I think we're right back to what you started with before, that in an atomized society where the idea of society has broken down, unless we're blunt, there's no sense of society left in China. They're desperately trying to rebuild it using the social credit system and surveillance.
No, it's not going to work.
Because 20 years of waffling about Confucianism as the way to save and make a new China hasn't worked.
Yeah.
So they're trying social credit. Again, they couldn't get it out of persuasion, so they'll try and get it out of threat. Try getting a cohesive response out of families that are afraid of losing single sons who are not effectively socialised, and that even though they've used the nationalist card, they haven't done hardcore nasty violence on an international scale. They've brutalised their minorities,
That's
which
a
probably makes them
different
feel
level of
nice and
violence.
superior.
Yeah.
But what we see historically is that militaries who've brutalised their own populations, when they go up against a near-peer army or near-peer force, tend to get their asses kicked. Because the idea that these people don't just fight back, but they kill all of you, is not something the headspace can deal with.
Or which is another thing too. You raised the point that China's never really fought, or modern China hasn't really fought a war. I suppose you could say, well, 1979, their punitive invasion of Vietnam was a war of sorts, but they certainly got their backsides kicked quite badly by the
and
Vietnamese.
only of sorts. And this is the thing, the Vietnamese were tired and their kit was old and they still...
knocked them back.
So this is one of those cases that, don't ever underestimate Vietnam from a Chinese perspective. India has spent a fortune buying good kit and training people.
Yeah.
And the Indians and Vietnamese have a good strategic support agreement. So really, a China that wants to go against two countries who've done constant violence for generations and understand what constant small wars look like, really?
This raises an interesting idea, or a dilemma for the CCP, and that is that now they're being hurt by US sanctions and the trade war. They're left with fewer and fewer cards the longer this thing drags out.
Yep.
It becomes a matter of regime survival. They either try to do something nasty to the United States in a way that the US will understand, namely take kinetic action of some description, or they try to hunker down and wait this out by being more brutal against their own population, because they know that if they can't satisfy the idea of Chinese pride, because how I made mention that Iran is a civilizational actor,
same
so
thing
is
with China.
China.
Yeah.
Because, China has to be divorced from the CCP. The CCP are the tenants of China for now, but they're not going to be there forever.
No.
The thing that drives the Chinese people, if I can use that term very loosely, is the identification that China is a civilization that's been around for thousands of years. And what is this young upstart, the United States, going to do to us? We were here before they were even thought of, and we will be here after they're well and truly in the dust in terms of geopolitical space and time. So can it be then that the Chinese will end up rebelling in a much more organised fashion against the CCP if all of a sudden families have their sons stripped away, put into uniform, flying the flag, defending an interest which is not in China's interest, only the CCP's narrowly defined interest?
Well, let's go back to Peter Singer's way around this in Ghost Fleet. He assumes that the CCP do try and brutalise the population, and the military side with the industrial financial elite, and you get a sort of an agreement between the military and the money to take the CCP out. And because the military and the money don't pretend ideology, they just get on with, we're going to be rich and we're going to be strong, that is actually more persuasive because it doesn't have the delusion of ideology rolled in. And I think at some level, that's one of the bits of the book where I go, okay, you don't explain exactly how and why this happened. He suggests something that is a bit like Tiananmen Part 2. The state ordered the military to take out a whole pile of processors in a city, and the PLA make a deal with the financial people and go, no, let's take out the CCP together. And it's a very interesting idea, and I think indicates that really all it's about is deliver wealth and deliver status. Leave the pride intact, and you'll be allowed to rule.
So future war isn't really necessarily limited to defending yourself against external pressures.
No, it's internal, because all of this, as we keep coming back to, is not about existential threat.
Yeah.
It's about regime survival. And this is why, I don't mind talking about the nuclear card, but I think it's really important to go for regime survival. If you were to use nukes, the whole world will hold it against you forever, because it wasn't to stop existential threat. And I think in a lot of cases, Putin's not mad. Kim Jong-un is not mad. The Iranians aren't mad. They're all hyper-rational and play the best game they can with the resources they have.
But once their game is over, they're not going to just whimper off into the night. They're going to
They're going to go out with a bang, but
they will.
But a nuclear bang. You have to. Well, I suppose the question at the end of the day: are all these people at any level? Do they love their country, or do they just love power?
Well, I mean, there's one thing, but then the other thing is, you talk about existential threat. Maybe not for the state, but for the state apparatus, it is an existential threat.
Again,
so, I mean, it depends on interpretation.
Yeah, but again, it's that thing of, is it the regime we're talking about, or is it the state? And I think in all cases we're talking about, there's regimes here that cause problems, potentially will go to war for the sake of the regime, arguing that that is existential threat for the nation, and it's not. It's only regime threat. And this is why Western rhetoric needs to wise up dramatically. When we do the big stick of be nice, be liberal, be democratic, well, what are we saying we want? Well, we don't want that regime. It's not that we got a problem with China, we have a problem with the CCP. It's not that we have a problem with Russia, it's that we have a problem with things that Putin does. It's not that we have a problem with North Korea, it's that we have a problem with Kim Jong-un threatening to make Seoul and chunks of Japan glow in the dark. The problem here is not countries, and yet the Western press keeps using countries rather than individuals or regimes, which I think is a great mistake. Because when people sit and read about this, they go, oh no, this looks like traditional war. No, it's not traditional war. This is not about the existential threat of states. It's only about the existential threat of regimes. And regimes have come and gone throughout history. States tend to survive longer than regimes.
Tim?
Do you think in some part, though, that these are actors that have patterns that, so for instance, like, we're not saying bad things, or we don't express negative intentions toward Russia, for instance, or we express those towards Putin, but if Russia is an actor that continually threatens the West, then is that why that...
The longer that a regime exists, the more it starts to affect the strategic culture of the country, and eventually what the regime thinks is what it will condition its political, military and economic elite to.
Is it also possible that, if we take the idea of the state being an individual writ large, we could reduce it and rationalize it differently, that it isn't the state as a whole, but it's the government that is an individual writ large, because it has all the hallmarks of having cultural identification as well as psychoses. If you happen to be
it's the frontal
an
cortex.
autocrat,
It's the bit that does the deliberate thinking and tries to give the body orders.
Right. So if you happen to be in a country with an autocratic government, you have a sociopathic need for control and dominance, which would really translate down to an individual having a similar sort of desire, right? So you can scale it up and scale it down, whichever way you like. But then again, to try to lump all of your cultural or demographic issues within the context of a government isn't necessarily correct either. It's not even accurate.
And this is why we've sort of touched on this in multiple roundabout ways, that to keep your regime upright, you have external enemies and you have internal instability. So you're constantly, all these regimes that potentially cause problems, including the American political elite, who are now, it seems, basically divorced from their own people. And if we are seeing the return of Project for a New American Century, those loopies hopefully have very little to do with most of the US population.
Yep.
The US population will have to go and fight and die for them. But if PNAC's back, remember sort of Wes Clark's famous interview where he makes the point of going into the Pentagon to see Rumsfeld and then running into one of his former colonels. And this colonel goes, "Sir, we're invading 9 countries in the next 6 years." And Wes goes, "What?" Yes, sir, but we don't know why. That's Project for the New American Century. That's exactly what we're talking about here. The distinction between the regime or the elite and their own population and the world.
Yeah.
And that as much as people want to make war about technology, it always comes back to people. But it comes back to a limited number of people who, if given enough time, their strategic culture will infect the broader culture of society. Not necessarily completely. But it's always a regime is interacting with the world and trying to effectively manage, whether it's through hegemony or domination or democratic persuasion, its own people.
Dare I say that the Chinese One Belt, One Road is very much part of that sort of notion of contagion. Wherever the One Belt, One Road thing cuts through, it cuts through societies and states that are dependent on Chinese trade. And over time, if the CCP continues to maintain it in its current form, then the likelihood of Chinese autocratic tendencies bleeding off into areas in Central Asia, for instance, maybe even infecting other places as well.
Well, let's take a lovely African example.
Yeah.
So a beautiful World Heritage listed island in Kenya. They want to build a super port on the edge of it by dredging it, put an international airport in the middle of beautiful green space, and put in a coal-fired power plant to power the port and the airport.
Chinese economic development just there.
It's like, okay, well, no, what you're doing is making a mini bit of very polluted, dirty and ugly China on a beautiful Kenyan island. Thank God the Kenyans are going, what the?
Yeah.
But whether the Kenyans will have the ability to stop it is a whole other issue.
It's got nothing to do with the Kenyan people. It's got everything to do with the Kenyan
regime
government. And if the Kenyan government says, well, Chinese money is more important to us because it means that we can buy off the local population with a whole
or
heap of goods.
brutalise them, or both.
Or both, probably both. But it is a big thing for the Kenyan government and its survival. So they will leverage off. And unfortunately, you raise Africa, and Africa is going to eventually, if the People's Republic doesn't change its way, it will turn into a huge dumping ground for the PRC.
And that is a place where people know how to fight back.
Yeah.
And they know how to live on nothing.
Yep.
And they know how to hold the faith that we can overcome this. Like, here's a continent that was put through the worst of what Europe could dish out and still found their way to independence. And all right, the path has been painful, but they know how to fight back. They know how to resist.
Yep.
And they are culturally proud of what they are and who they are, and don't want to go under anyone's boot. And this is part of the problem that all colonial powers had in Africa. They all thought, oh, surely they'll just eventually accept being dominated by us. No.
Well,
This
I mean,
is a thing of
and of
cultural
course,
pride.
And of course, the 19th century European notion that anyone of a different skin color happens to not be part of the human race. Also,
Yeah, well, not being rude, but the CCP thinks very similarly.
Well, my experience in Ethiopia, speaking to some of the locals with regard to what they think about local Chinese investment, certainly says that is the case. I mean, they are very skeptical. They'll take the Chinese money for sure, but that doesn't mean that they want to, swallow the Kool-Aid if we go down that path. Yeah.
So, immaterial of the fact that we started with what does the initial phase of the war look like, we very quickly get to the point where the super advanced weapons and countermeasures are gone and we're down to people. And we have so many questions here. Will the average person want to fight to save their regime when it really isn't about their country? Will they be able to dominate people who love their culture and independence?
But if their culture and independence can be guaranteed when the regime is done with, then what is the point of fighting for the regime?
Precisely, and that's the thing. In a world where information finds ways into the cracks, it's nice to be an optimist some days. I'm having an optimistic day of going, I think most humans, given enough information, can see the difference between the regime and them. And that most of the wars that seem to be coming are nothing to do with us as citizens and everything to do with political elites worldwide not wanting to lose their lollipop. And I know it sounds trite to reduce it to that, but I want it to be trite because I want it to stick in people's head. The wars that are coming are over elites not wanting to lose their lollipops.
Including PNAC.
And do we globally want to die for people who don't want to surrender their lollipops? And I would hope at a very broad level that one thing we can agree on, even if we have massive cultural differences and can't agree on trade and can't agree on this and can't agree on that, it's that we don't want to die for people who risk nothing and sacrifice us for the sake of personal and regime power.
Yeah, because they only hold us in contempt in the end, don't they?
Yeah, and this is the point. We're not talking about national armies of citizens anymore fighting to save the society, culture and state from existential threat that would annihilate everything. We're back into a world of almost medieval violence. It's just about the elite wanting to have more power or sustain the power they've got and buying off who they can to fight and die for them so they don't have to.
David, just on a final point here, and touching on what you've just said, do you think that if we were to ever rediscover the social and political benefits of citizen soldiers, and that we were to rediscover the benefit of national service, for instance, or the idea of serving the nation, whether it be in a military or a non-military role, would we get better political systems? Would we get more integrated people that feel as though that they are serving their country as opposed to serving a government or an agenda?
Yes, because the minute every politician's kid is going to have to do military or civil national service, we start having them go, well, my kid's not safe in law school or medical school. And I think that would be a game changer. They either have to have served or their kids have to have served, otherwise they don't get it and they're just part of the power elite. And it doesn't matter whether it's democracy, authoritarianism or a half-breed.
Yeah.
The reality is if the political elite don't have anything personally to risk, they make decisions about power, not decisions about society as a whole.
Excellent. Well, on that very depressing point, that's a wrap, everybody. Thanks for joining us, David and Tim.
Remember my bit of optimism about we can have the brains to say we're not fighting for your lollipop.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll find us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategikon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Up to $26,000 per employee? They call it the 15-minute refund, but it's not a gimmick. It's for business owners who stuck it out during the pandemic. The Employee Retention Tax Credit, or ERTC. But time is running out to get started. Talk to the experts. JWC Advisors at iHeartTaxRefunds.com. Who are they? CPAs who will keep you on the right side of the IRS. So do it the right way. Go to iHeartTaxRefunds.com. That's iHeartTaxRefunds.com.